welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Oh, this time.
I'm last.
Yeah, Iad gets second billing this time.
What?
Well, I'm first billing, you're second billing, and Sam is bringing up the rear.
Featuring.
You do the billing. You don't bill yourself.
That's true. I'm the biller.
Yeah.
Today we are discussing the first book in our Obsession series with Nabokov's Pale Fire. You can join our book club discussion if you're interested on Reddit at Canonical Pod, and you can find that link in the episode description. And you can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod. If you want to support us, you can find our bookshop.org link. And using that link, you can find the books that we recommend and the books we read for our book club. If you haven't read this book before, you might be interested in listening to our review, which was published last week. So the academic fandom surrounding this book is honestly unlike any other that I've come across, with perhaps the exception of Joyce's Ulysses. There are multiple academics writing in a tenor resembling conspiracy theorists decoding a secret text. They've proffered different readings of the novel. I have 5 popular ones. They include 1, what the text in Pale Fire presents to us is true, that Kinbote is King Charles and the target of an assassination. 2, that John Shade is the internal author of the whole book, and that Kinbote is his alter ego or closeted self. That one's quite interesting because it creates this kind of tension between the two characters. By the way, these people are called Shadians, people who interpret text in this way. That's what they're called. They're called Shadians. And it's quite interesting because it's following up on our theme of mirror that I mentioned last time, that Kinbote is his mirrored alter ego, that Shade is in fact a closeted homosexual who's being henpecked by his wife. So what you see in Kinbote is actually his internal struggle. 3, that Kinbote is the writer of the entirety of the book, and these, I believe, are called Kinbotians. Not Cambodians, but Kinbotians, I believe. 4, that Shade is the author of the poem, but Kinbote is delusional, and Zembla is a creation of his madness. I think this has pretty widespread appeal. I think a lot of people agree with this one. And 5, this one is a little bit out there, that the actual writer is V. Botkin, a character who is in the index and appears very briefly in the book. But there are various references throughout the book to V. Botkin. He is a Russian professor at the university who translates books into English. So when you were reading this book, did you interpret it in any of these ways?
I think the 4th one you mentioned, that Shade is the author of the poem, but Kinbote is crazy, and that Zembla is part of his delusion. I think that's the most straightforward, even though you mentioned that, if you take everything as true in the book, I guess that's slightly more straightforward. I get the feeling that the one that Kinbote is crazy is the most basic reading out there. And I think I'm not putting that reading down. That's the way I'm reading it.
Yeah, if you read it this way, the assassin is someone who was released from a mental hospital.
Right.
I think it's described as ICI in the book. I don't remember what the initials stand for, but he's released from this insanatorium, and then he goes to kill the landlord who Kinbote is renting the house from.
Yeah, the judge, Goldsmith.
Right, because he looks like Shade.
Yeah, the landlord is the judge who sentenced him to that insane asylum or wherever he's from.
Right. The others do have weight to them, at least to some degree. Just at the very basic level, Botkin matches up with Nabokov's playfulness with the spelling of things.
Botkin is kind of like Kinbote rearranged.
Right. And he does that in other parts with other characters. and other places. He plays with letters.
Or like Donald Odin.
Right.
James, which one of these do you think you buy the most?
For me, I'm with Sam. I subscribe to number 4, but I am really interested in number 2. That one is the Shadian reading of the book. I think perhaps I'm Shadian sympathetic, you might say.
It's a really interesting reading.
It is. It is because, Kinbote is very much the opposite of Shade, right? He's very absurd. He's not reserved. Shade is quite reserved. And just the fact that he is so openly homosexual. I mean, open in that, and this is something you'll talk about, Sam, but he's not open as in he's proclaiming it, but he is very promiscuous.
He doesn't hide it.
Yeah, he's always talking about young lads that he has run across. And if you view that as his closeted psyche, I mean, that's a very interesting reading.
Right.
With all of these readings out there, if you choose to be a Shadian, what sort of attitude do you have to have towards the other ones? Like, what does it mean to be a Shadian versus not?
Right. I'm curious about this too. Like, do you have to denounce the others?
I believe there are annual conferences, Nabokov conferences, where people get together and, propose these theories to each other. And I think the general atmosphere is one of conviviality. I don't think they bash each other, but I think they do, as far as academics go, they do strongly criticize or disagree with each other. The last theory I listed, that V. Botkin is a character who appears briefly in the book, has been quote unquote approved by Nabokov himself. And I don't really put any stock in that at all. But I think his attitude toward these different readings has actually spurred on this cottage industry of interpreting Pale Fire.
Yeah. This is why I can't really endorse any of them. Like Sam, I think that, I started with option 1, where what we see in the text is true. And then as you realize that he's more unreliable, you start to realize number 4, that Kinbote is delusional and Zembla doesn't exist. But as far as being a Shadian or a Botkinite or whatever, again, it just seems to miss the point. For me, the point is the tension between the texture of this novel. It's a very dense novel. There's lots of things being said, and it's full of description, yet it's still open to so much interpretation. The fact that all of these things are still possible and they don't contradict each other is the point. And to choose any of them and exclude the others just seems to throw away all of the fun.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. They're all plausible in some way. And I think that's the point. The plausibility of all of these theories makes this novel interesting.
So a lot of these academics have kind of built their careers around these interpretations. They've written multiple books. There is one academic who I believe has moved from one theory to the next 3 times now. He has proposed 3 different theories, and he is a tenured professor. He's not just some kind of fanboy. A tenured professor who has built his career on Pale Fire. So, I mean, do you think these essays even matter? Like, does it matter how one interprets what's going on here narratively? Because, yeah, it sounds to me like you're saying it doesn't matter.
This is a type of literary analysis that I have really very little time for, because it seems like you found a spot where you can kind of dig in and you're just content with just kind of digging in for the rest of your career. And it just seems lazy. Like, it's very clear that there's ambiguity here, but it's so much ambiguity that it seems clearly deliberate. And avoiding how deliberate the ambiguity seems to just focus on puzzling out which one is the right answer and which are the wrong answers seems like you're skipping the hard question and going for the easy question. Like, I think it's much more interesting to figure out why Nabokov is interested in this kind of ambiguity and how this ambiguity makes the novel a more interesting novel to read than it is to figure out which of these options is the correct option.
I mean, there's a certain audience that cares about that, and he's writing for that audience, but that audience is very small. I get the sense that the people that are going to dig into this level of academia and stay on it is a fairly small minority of readers. It's fine that they're interested in that, but it seems like a very circular, insular group.
Yeah, I agree. I think, that phrase, missing the forest for the trees, really applies here because they're so laser focused on this one aspect of the book that, as you said, Yed, it really doesn't matter that much. But at the same time, I do think that this kind of conspiracy theorizing is fun. Like, it's a fun activity. I think it's a little bit absurd that you can get tenure by publishing multiple books, interpreting and reinterpreting the same book, but it's more of a commentary on academia. There is an aspect of this that is fun, this kind of interpretive aspect of like, oh, this is what's going on. You can figure it out. But beyond that, there's not much. It's kind of a light, fluffy fun.
I think the significance of the difference between all of these also depends on how much in the foreground you consider these characters as having distinct lives and personalities. And to me, they are distinct from each other, but they are all very clearly descendant from Nabokov himself. So I never really think of, is this Kinbote or is this Shade? I always think, is this part of Nabokov or that part of Nabokov? And when I read the novel in that way, it's not really important to me who is doing what, but the fact that the chess pieces are on the board. That's what matters to me, rather than where they're actually standing.
The Shadian reading of the book, I think, is quite compelling, but it does move it very squarely into a more realist text because the commentary and all that is plumbing the psychology of this kind of character. If you read this as, very formalist, and that's the appeal, then this exploration of a closeted individual is not that appealing.
Yeah, because then it seems like it's another one of those kind of novels with a key. It's a Romana clef where you're just finding the way of understanding the true nature of the novel. And then once you understand it, it's more about sexuality and more about identity. And it's unpacking some secret prize and forgetting the shell. And for me, the shell is actually the beautiful, enjoyable thing that we shouldn't forget.
I think one of the reasons for this is Nabokov himself encourages this. I don't know why. I mean, part of it is, he designs chess puzzles. And I think he has that kind of mind. He's wired in this way. Or he designed chess puzzles because, he's dead. I don't think he's doing it anymore from the grave.
You sure?
I'm not sure. I don't know. It's unknowable.
Well, there are people out there who create things and they are offended by what they see as incorrect interpretations.
Yeah.
But Nabokov is certainly not that type of person. I think that he is of the school of thought that there's no such thing as bad press. As long as you're talking about my novel, that's good. So I think if somebody says, I think it's all Shade, or I think it's all Kinbote, or I think it's all Botkin, he's going to say, yes, run with it, because no matter what you do, you're talking about him.
Even though you say that the shell is more important, I do think the idea of the closeted self in the Shadian reading is something worth talking about. That comes up a little bit in this essay I read. A critic named Jean Walton wrote an essay called Dissenting in an Age of Frenzied Heterosexualism, Kinbote's Transparent Closet in Nabokov's Pale Fire. And in that essay, she discusses some of this depth here that we're talking about. I came across the essay because I was struggling with my reading of Kinbote, mostly because he comes across as this comic portrayal of an insane religious gay man. And he's both the unreliable narrator / protagonist, and in some ways he's the story's logical villain. But Jean says that that's not only a flawed heteronormative read of the novel, it's also missing some of that depth that we've been talking about. The central image that Walton keeps coming back to is this idea that Kinbote is contained in an invisible closet. So a closet that doesn't actually conceal Kinbote. And the image invokes his homosexuality, but Walton says that's intentionally misleading. For example, Kinbote does not really hide his sexuality, as James pointed out. What is hidden and not hidden is his insanity, which is hidden from himself, and his supposed royalty, which he thinks is hidden from Nuai and the world. A great example we see of this is when Nabokov tells Kinbote to be more careful. The reader at first assumes, or at least I assumed, that he meant about Kinbote's sexuality. Well, Kinbote is actually concerned about his royal secret. But as it turns out, Nabokov is just talking about how Kinbote was rude about another faculty member. Walton goes on to describe how Kinbote serves as this sort of dissenter to an oppressive heterosexualism in our society, a sort of anti-hero and resistor. Do either of you agree with that reading? I felt like I had fallen into this trap that she talks about, but she makes a good point of how lovingly Nabokov treats him. Even as a comedic villain, he's sympathetic in the way that Lolita's Humbert Humbert is. And so I think I'm inclined to agree with most of her points.
What's interesting to me when I read this critique of Kinbote is that it seems to be talking about how people are often defined by one overriding identity. So like for me, as Chinese American, I'd be defined as Chinese American. If I were homosexual, I don't think I would be defined as homosexual. I would still be defined as Chinese American. You see that a lot. I think we talked about this in our African American fiction series briefly about how Black gay people often are just identified as Black, not as Black and gay or as gay, even if they themselves identify with one more strongly than the other. So it seems to be getting at that for me, that there are these kind of overriding identifiers that society places onto groups of people, that certain minority groups are more clearly defined or more easily defined than others.
Yeah, I think certain things stand out more clearly. And it's not that one person is trying to hide part of his identity, but because the other things are more obviously seen, people will just ignore the things that are more difficult to notice. I don't think that Nabokov is especially sympathetic to homosexuality in the way that perhaps Walton or a 2021 reader would be. I think he still has a 1960s attitude towards it. I think that in the novel, Kinbote is queer in the 1960s sense of the term, like he's off. And I think that Nabokov is using his homosexuality as a way of showing that this guy is a little bit weird. But at the same time, I don't think that his pathologizing of Kinbote's homosexuality is at odds with his sympathetic depiction of Kinbote. I think the two can coexist. To Nabokov's credit, he's not a demon. You said some people might say that he's a villain of the novel. I never thought that for a moment. Like, he's never a bad person because he's gay. It's just that I think that Nabokov doesn't have a completely modern take on homosexuality.
It's the promiscuity that kind of sticks out. That's the stereotype back then of homosexuals.
We didn't talk about this in our review episode when we were talking about his background, but his brother, and I think it's his next youngest sibling, Sergei, was gay And depending on who you read, they were mostly very close, and that the family acknowledged his homosexuality while at the same time not really talking directly about it.
I will say, though, that Nabokov is not anti-queer, and he's not, this kind of dogmatic writer or dogmatic thinker who says, we have to have some sort of orthodoxy. In fact, I would say that he really is, you could say, maybe a champion of the underdog. Like, he really relishes talking and writing and thinking about these kinds of people. But I think that the modern sensibility doesn't want to be placing these quote unquote queer characters in a zoo. I think the modern sensibility is that they should not be othered in this way. To get back to what Walton has to say, I think that I agree with her that it's not a case of a closeted identity that is actually visible to everyone, but rather that there is a transparent closet, and it's transparent not because what Kinbote thinks is hidden can actually be seen by everyone around him, but rather just because identities themselves, whether singular or, as most people have, plural identities, are in themselves opaque. And we don't need to try to hide them in order for them to be hidden, not only from other people, but hidden from ourselves. So for me, the biggest theme of the novel, the largest thing, is reading and misreading. And for me, I think that the homosexuality integrates into that theme just because identity is another place for reading and misreading to happen. We have it not only with the homosexual identity, but also with the anti-Marxist identity that Kinbote and Nabokov has, homosexuality, the European identity being European white, but in America, because you have this feeling that Kinbote himself, but also when Gradus arrives in New York, this feeling that as a European in America, you're out of place, but not obviously out of place. And people don't know that you're out of place until they begin speaking to you. There is a lot of talk about how people speak and whether or not they can speak fluently or with broken English or broken French. So I think that hidden things are important, but they're not hidden because we try to hide them, but because we can't help but hide them. So here's something I want to ask both of you just as a broad question, not even for Pale Fire specifically, but for writing in general. Do you think that writers are more driven by the expression of a sincere emotion or an idea? Or do you think that writers are more driven by expressing a very clever turn of phrase?
Wouldn't that depend on the writer?
In general, which do you think matters more?
I think that if you take all of writing, which includes, romance novels, mystery novels, the emotion is more compelling. It's what draws people to storytelling. But you can tell stories in a lot of different ways. You can tell stories orally via podcast. You can tell stories using film. So you don't have to write to tell stories, but it's one way of telling stories. And it's the more general appeal for people who create stories. But the people who are interested in writing, someone who's a prose stylist like Dillard or Roth, I think these people are more interested in putting words together.
The reason why I ask this question is because I think that most writers, regardless of whether or not they consider themselves to be like really advanced prose stylists, would say, at least to some degree, they would pay lip service to the expression of a sincere emotion. But I think that Pale Fire can actually be read as an answer to this question. It's, to my mind, an advocate for what you could call anti-sincerity. I think that this novel really intends to undermine the idea that when writers write, They're motivated by expressing something inside of them or something inside of a character. And I think it really is meant to show us something much more artificial than that. The reason why I get to that conclusion is because of the poem at the center of this novel. I found the poem enjoyable on its own, and I think we all agreed, right? You all like the poem.
I do, but I also read people who thought it was a really great poem, and I don't think it was a really great poem. I thought it was a
Yeah.
good poem and I appreciated the narrative aspects of it.
Well, it has been published on its own in a separate volume before, so you could read it separately if you chose to. I don't think it's a wonderful poem, but I think it's a competent poem. But I do think that it's a bit dated and rigid, particularly for our time, but even in the early 1960s. Its strong sense of narrative is kind of out of fashion. Its formalistic style in iambic pentameter, heroic couplets, also is quite rigid, but specifically its confessional content was kind of waning in the 1960s. Here I'm thinking of poets like Sylvia Plath or Anne Sexton. I'm thinking that most readers will come to this novel and see the commentary as the important bit. And the poem itself is kind of this anachronism, and the commentary is meant to speak to the poem itself, but also this quality, this confessional quality of poetry in general in the 1960s. So what do you think of this tension between the commentary and the poem itself? What is the intention that you think Nabokov has in mind?
I don't know how much this really answers your question, but I saw a theory that the reason he started this project was because he translated the Russian poem Eugene Onegin by Pushkin, and that his own commentary in his notes, in his scribbles in the margins and whatnot, resembled what we see here, that he ended up talking more about himself than the poem that he was supposed to be translating, and that he enjoyed this meta-fictional format so much, and his own silly notes, that he decided to write a novel around it. I do find the poem enjoyable. I think I probably enjoyed it more than the both of you, but I agree that it is good. But I don't really see the point of publishing it on its own.
That poem that's published on its own, I don't know if you've looked at it, but I haven't looked at it. I read a description of it. It's on index cards.
Oh,
It's published
well,
the way that Kinbote describes it. So it's kind of a curiosity for Nabokov fans, people who are really into Nabokov and they just need to have this collector's item. But that in and of itself kind of answers your question. It's not really being given to us as a poem, at least what I saw, that product. It's given to us as a curiosity.
I'm not really too concerned with reading the poem by itself because clearly it existed in the world as part of a novel. And I think that, Nabokov intends for the poem to interact with the index and the commentary. And that interaction is what's important. I think that the interaction, it's presented to us because it's meant to highlight a deficiency of the poem. I think that this type of confessional poetry, it's built, I think, on the premise, it's built on the poetics of personal experience as being important and the mining of personal experience for sincere hidden truths about life as being kind of the point of literature. And I think that Nabokov is undermining that enterprise by pointing to the deficiencies of that kind of poetry by packaging it with a commentary that, to my mind, clearly outshines it and undermines the idea that sincerity is so important. Pale Fire, I think it belongs to a tradition of novels that pretend to be something else. Here I'm thinking probably the best example is Gulliver's Travels, where in the beginning of the novel, even though it's ostensibly written by Swift, you have the introduction written by Simpson. And he says, I received this letter from my cousin, Gulliver, about his travels throughout the world, and I'm going to share them with you. So it's fiction, but presented as something from the real world. I think that this is something that we see a lot nowadays. People sometimes call these nested frame stories fractal fiction, where the work itself becomes part of the work. So the poem Pale Fire is part of the novel Pale Fire. But I think that Pale Fire takes it one step further, because when you read these old novels that have a framing device where you try to imagine that the text was written in some real life scenario, you try to ignore its fictional aspect, it requires a suspension of disbelief. It requires you to forget for a moment that this is actually not written by Gulliver. It's not written by Simpson. It's written by Swift. With this novel, like I said earlier, I don't forget for a moment that this novel is written by Nabokov. I never think that it's written by Shade. I never think that it's written by Kinbote. And that, to me, I think is very important, because it constantly reminds us of the artifice of the whole endeavor. It's constantly saying sincerity is bunk, sincerity is useless, artifice alone is important. So what do you think about that? Does that kind of reading really change the way we should approach other works of fiction? Or is this a conclusion that we could say is more or less self-contained within this novel and has no bearing on the rest of literature?
No, I think it does have bearing on them. Maybe not a large subset of literature, but certainly a subset. But you're right. The artifice is never gone from the page. All about artifice.
Do you think it's like a mockumentary?
Sort of.
I suppose yes. Yeah, I mean, the form is always present in the mockumentary style. It's pretending to be something other than it is. So yeah, that would be perhaps a descendant of this. Just like you were saying in the previous episode, how you really had some emotional response to these characters. And I think that was a big disagreement between us. I didn't have that emotional response because I never considered them as people with feelings. They never attained that type of reality. And that type of reality is still valuable to me, but it's not exclusively valuable in the way that I think novels previous to this might have felt to me.
I guess mockumentary sounds like it's dismissive, right? But I'm not really being dismissive. I'm just saying that it calls attention to its own purpose. Like that's what a mockumentary does. And you can't escape it when you watch it.
I think a mockumentary uses the interview format as a pretext for the jokes. It creates a scenario where the jokes would arise. Whereas with Pale Fire, I think that it's not a pretext, but rather an interaction between the form of a commentary to an annotated poem and the poem itself. That's the appeal in itself rather than the pretext to an appeal. When we read Kinbote reading Pale Fire, we are able to laugh at him because he very clearly doesn't understand shade. But then we also are invited, I think, to laugh at ourselves because we are engaged in a second order of interpretation when we are interpreting Pale Fire, the novel, rather than the poem. So I think the magic trick that people have been trying to pull off for a long time is how to get rid of that title page that says Nabokov or Jonathan Swift. Like, how do we so thoroughly convince everybody that this thing that I'm writing has a reality besides me making it up? And I think that maybe what Nabokov is doing here is by saying, forget about forgetting that I made this up. Remember that I made it up, but also remember when you try to figure out what I mean, you're going to fuck it up in the same way that Kinbote did.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. He's definitely doing away with that attempt and just putting his name first and foremost.
I mean, when he was writing in Germany, he was using a pen name at first. He was Vladimir Sirin. If he had published this under a pen name, if he published this as Pale Fire by John Shade, first of all, people probably wouldn't read it. But second of all, do you think that changing the actual cover and the pretext that you would encounter this novel, would that change the effect in any way?
The thing is that I think while he is pointing out the artifice of creating fiction, I think this book is more than just pointing out the artifice of creating fiction. Like, there is very real tension between the commentary and the text, and between the characters, Kinbote, who wrote the commentary, and Shade, who wrote the text. I think if you only talk about how this is a commentary on how writing creates a reality that isn't really a reality, or how authors are attempting to do something but they can't do it, for me, it kind of cuts out all the other ways of reading the novel that are fun or interesting in the book.
I would say, yeah, you have to be able to do both to pull it off. Like, if this were a shitty novel or a shitty poem, and then it just had this kind of formal tension, I would say no. But if you can write a really good poem or a pretty good poem, and then spin it with this interesting commentary and the tension between the commentary and the poem, you've gone beyond what the normal thing that writers do to the amazing thing that very few people do. I think that there's a difference here between the three of us, particularly probably between me and James. And I think that with James, the well-written story remains central. Like, I think you are interested in the play, but you're much more interested in the well-written story. And for me, I think the play is much more important. That's the unique, valuable thing that I see in this novel. As I said earlier, I think that this is a very anti-sincere novel. This is an attack on the idea that sincere emotion is the source of textual value. It's a very postmodern sort of thing to write. I think it's not for nothing that this postmodern thing that people are interested in, they call it the new sincerity. Like, this kind of sincere, genuine feeling of emotions, this feeling that something has been communicated intelligibly from writer to reader, is something that maybe readers like you, James, would prefer, or you're kind of thirsting for. Do you think that's fair?
The form for me is interesting, but my enjoyment of this book is the form plus. It's not just the form. So yeah, I think it's fair. It's not that I'm seeking out or I have to have sincerity. What I'm saying is that I see the sincerity in the book, and I appreciate that as well. Like, for example, when King Charles is escaping, there is some suspense in that story, even though by the end of the book, you realize it's probably all a lie, and he is playing with what is real, quote unquote, real, and what is not real in the book. He's playing around with that idea. So you've been toyed with, But in the process of reading that story, it is still very compelling. So it's not just artifice. That's what I'm saying. I can hold both points of view in my mind, that it is compelling, it is a story, and it is moving, but at the same time, it is something that the writer is toying around with. I really did like the parallel structures that he sets up in the poem I mentioned before, where the scene where Hazel's committing suicide, and he gives us, at the same time, the parents are at home watching TV and wondering what she's doing. And he kind of does the same thing with the assassin making his way across the country. And at the same time, he gives us what is going on in the last moments of Shade's life. Yeah, this whole book is artificial, but that construction creates tension and it's interesting to read. And it's also moving because even though someone will be shot and you know who's going to be shot, you're still kind of dragged along that narrative. Like there is a narrative appeal. It's not for me just a commentary on form or on how fiction plays around with what we believe to be real or not.
Yes, you're right here. I don't think that it's deficient in terms of narrative, and I don't think it's deficient in terms of necessarily in terms of emotional appeal, even though that's not something that really appealed to me particularly. I think that, I can't deny your reading or the way that you reacted to it. I guess my way of thinking is very functional, where I'm always trying to think, well, I'm going to die. I have X number of years on this planet. I can read Y number of novels. What am I going to read? Because I can't read them all. And for me, the heuristic that helps me make that decision is what's the best value? What's the best bang for my buck? And absolutely, this kind of emotional value or narrative value is valuable, but that to me is more common. And having this plus the formal thing, to me, is really like why you should go to the bookstore and pick this up rather than something else.
I think the strongest argument for this being a commentary on narrative construction or artifice is the index. But the index has no emotional appeal at all. It is purely just artifice in my reading of it.
Yeah. For me, it's not like parts that are separable. These things live together. They're part of one thing. You couldn't cut one out and say, well, what is this like by itself? Because that thing by itself is not Pale Fire.
Right. If you're going to explain this to someone, you're not going to say it's about a guy who gets shot by an assassin who may or may not be an assassin. You would describe the artifice. You would describe the playfulness that's happening. But just because that's what you would choose this book for, that doesn't take away what the book is, how well it's written, and the emotional strings that he's at least trying to pull. If you just had the artifice and you didn't have the emotions and the playfulness of the language, I don't think the artifice would be enough.
All right, let's take a break now. When we come back, we'll talk about some of the comments Nabokov has made about Pale Fire after its publication. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So Nabokov has stated in an interview that the author commits suicide after finishing the book. Does this fact add anything to your reading of the novel?
Not really. I mean, first of all, I don't think that it matters much what he says because I, as the reader, could say something else. And I feel like my opinion is just as useful as Nabokov's after the book has been written. That's one of the points, like I was saying earlier, that reading and misreading is so common that whatever we expect is not really reliable, like we're as reliable as Kinbote is. So if we think he's going to commit suicide, it might happen, it might not happen. If Nabokov says that it might happen or it might not happen, I still don't think it matters much. It's not the kind of novel where things happening matters. Like, I've said pretty clearly, I think at this point, that for me, it's not what's happening, but the way the novel is structured, the form. So for me, it's not important.
I agree. It didn't really change anything for me. I just kind of shrugged it off and thought, oh.
Other critics have said that it's been hinted at throughout the book, that suicide is a theme in the book.
Yeah, there is a part 3/4 of the way through where Kinbote describes preferred methods of killing oneself. And he does make it sound like he's moving toward something. He talks about how the preferable way would be to fall from an airplane.
Yeah, without a parachute. Yeah.
But he describes slitting one's wrists in like a boarding house in the bathtub. And since he's writing this from what he calls a motor court, it does make it sound like he's setting himself up for something to happen in this motor court. But yeah, it's not 100% there.
For me, it doesn't really add too much to the novel whether or not Nabokov says there's a suicide or not. But I think there are seeds of that in the novel that are interesting. It's present for people who want to look for it. It adds a lot of texture to the narrative for me.
What does it add to a novel that a novelist is willing to appear in public saying things about the end of the novel? We tend to think of things in artistic work as being complete once they're published, but it seems like if the novelist lives beyond his work, he can continue to add things indefinitely. Like if he said 10 years after the novel was published, well, later on, Kinbote decided not to kill himself. Does that kind of explanation 10 years after the fact have the same weight that what he said 1 year after the fact does? It seems like there is a statute of limitations that we have on this kind of commentary that exists just kind of by default. Nobody has really tested it. It's kind of a gentleman's agreement among artists that once the thing is out there, you stop talking about it.
Oh man, no one told J.K. Rowling about this gentleman's agreement.
I was about to say, yeah.
The example I'm thinking of from music is maybe 5 years ago when Kanye West's album, The Life of Pablo, came out. It was released on all of the platforms, and then he took it back and he remixed some of the songs, and then he released it again. So I think this is something that's going to continue happening in our online era, our information age, where the idea of a finished product is going to disintegrate. There may be more Nabokovs and more J.K. Rowlings in the future who don't end things and then kind of follow this tacit agreement to remain silent. And I'm not sure if it's a good thing. I kind of like things being finalized.
I don't know that that's a sign of the times, though, as much as it's a sign of a certain type of personality.
I agree with you, Yed, in that if we look at what Rowling has done, she would routinely add to the canon by just, tweeting out details or publishing details on her Harry Potter website. I think that it's more feasible now because you can just have the online platform to add to a text. That even though it's not in the published text, it's in online text. So it's in a different form, but it's still part, of the discussion. It's still text and it
Yeah.
just gets amended. I definitely think it's much easier now as compared to even in Nabokov's time to amend it. He would have to give an interview, right? Like it's much more work to do that. And then if you move 100 years before that, like you'd have to physically print something and disseminate it. It's just getting easier and easier for someone to amend their finished work.
Yeah. Also, in the case of Pale Fire, like, I think the form of the novel encourages you to think of all of these paratextual elements, like indexes and commentaries, as being as valid as the thing itself. So, in that sense, we're encouraged to think that Nabokov's commentary in an interview after the novel has been published is as valid as the commentary or the index.
But as to whether or not I like it, I'm going to say probably no, just because it's tiring to keep up with all that. Like, I just, on a personal level, want to have a finished product.
Yes.
Well, and there's a reason we have editors too, right? I mean, ideally, we have the best version of a thing sitting in front of us. I agree. It is tiring to have to add to that to get what the author thinks is the complete version when you thought you already had the complete version.
Because it's not just extra work to read it or consume it. You also have to reevaluate it.
The original Blade Runner, I think, had 3 different main cuts, maybe more, but there were 3. There was the theatrical, and then there was director's cut, and then there was the final cut.
Yeah.
I know there are other movies like that, and it is kind of exhausting, but they usually have a reason for why they're being recut, but they're not always good reasons.
Or there are China cuts where they add things, like they add a scene with like Fan Bingbing talking to Tony Stark or something just to get her in the movie for the China audience. These don't bother me so much just because I imagine the director in his mind or her mind has an idea of what he wants or what she wants. And the changes come afterwards as a matter of practicality. But if you have J.K. Rowling or Kanye West or Nabokov actually changing things because they want to change things, then it undermines the idea of an auteur, like auteur theory from film, or just the authorial prerogative to make a decision and stick with it.
All right. Well, I didn't think we were going to talk about Kanye and J.K. Rowling in this episode, but we did. So,
congrats.
That hit those squares on that bingo card. Let's stop here. So next week, we will review The Tunnel by Ernesto Sabato. It's the second book in our series on obsession. We've got the reading schedule on Reddit at Canonical Pod, and you can also go there to find threads for our book club discussion every Friday. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.